So the theme of the talk tonight is maximising K2 development productivity in the business. And I guess what I'm really talking about there is following on from what Pete's been talking about is you've got K2 in the business, the business is invested in it. What are you going to do? How are you going to approach your development to make sure that you maximise the return that you get from that investment? And how are you going to measure that and how are you going to tell the business about that? So I'll just go through a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, as I just mentioned, K2 is a business investment. You've always got to remember that. It's always got to be in the forefront of your mind. The business have bought K2, they're expecting some kind of return on their investment. They haven't just bought it for you to play with, and they're expecting to see some value from it. The way I think about it is that you can customise and tailor your development methodologies and approaches to maximise the return that you can get from your investment. So I'm going to talk about some things that we did at Arrow when I was there, and continue to do now in terms of how we approach development to try and maximise returns. One of the key features of that is the use of prototypes. So I'm a big fan of using prototypes and getting them in front of the business. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how I try and use that to drive the requirements. One of the things I think is lost sometimes is in the maelstrom of building something and giving it to the business is handing over and giving the business control of their process. And there's some real key benefits out of giving the business control, and I'll touch on a bit later. So I'm going to talk about a few development essentials, things I think that should be done. From my perspective as a developer, I don't think they'll surprise any of the other developers in the room, but I think it's incumbent on us as developers to nudge and push our clients to also adopt those methodologies and practices. They may have a different idea or different thinking about why they should do things a certain way. As a developer, you probably think you know better as well, but I think it's incumbent on you to have that conversation with your clients and your IT department about what the best processes and practices are and make sure they get implemented. I already touched on this before as well. Another aspect is measure and report. It's all very well and good to automate a process and get people using it and everyone's happy, but ultimately the bean counters are in charge and they're going to want to know how much money and time you've saved. If you can go to business with those figures, without being prompted, you're going to look really good. You're going to get more and more work coming your way. And K2 is seen as a success, which is an important part of the process. And finally, I just want to talk about embracing change. I think change can be a real bane in people's life in IT. It's constant, sometimes it's difficult. I think one of the aspects that K2 really shines in is that sometimes change in other environments isn't as easy as it can be done in K2. So, really touched on this as well, but obviously you buy K2 for a reason and you want to get some value and productivity out of it. You want to lower your costs, you want to improve efficiency, you want to drive accountability and standards, you want to improve insight and visibility into your processes, all those good things. They're the reasons that people want you to build and automate a process for them. But to keep those things front of mind. But your approach to how you develop things and how you release them into the business can really have a big impact on the return on investment on those very things. So if it takes you 10 times as long as normal to build a process, obviously you've lost some efficiency there. It's cost you more to build the application. If you can get the application out in a short amount of time, you're benefiting the business. So all these things that come together to help you drive those efficiencies I want to talk about in this presentation. So we want solutions that are delivered quickly and cheaply. Not so quickly and cheaply that they don't work. They've got to work. And they've got to provide demonstrable value. So you've got to show the business that these are working, they're benefiting. You want solutions that can adapt. As I mentioned before, things are always changing. You don't want a solution that's so rigid and hard to change that you can't, without a great deal of hardship, modify that process, and K2 is great for that. You want solutions that the business uses. It's no good building something, getting it out there, it works, but no one really wants to use it. And just touch on the concept of disposable apps, which is a bit of a buzzword in the K2 sphere at the moment, but this idea that you can build an application that fills a short-term temporary need. It doesn't have to be the permanent solution. I think we've all been in situations where a company's been thinking about implementing a big system for years, it seems like, and in the meantime there's this gap. K2 is a great opportunity to fill that gap with a short-term solution that may only last 6 months or a year. You can finish that solution when you implement the actual other solution. So, not all solutions are created equal. We've all worked on things that are simple and quick to build, and we've all worked on big, large, complex projects. So the solutions range from the small and the simple to the large and the complex. They also differ in business criticality. Some processes are directly linked to your revenue. They're processes that drive the business, get the money in the door. Others are just nice things to have in the business because, like Dave said, people don't like filling out forms and handing them to the boss. So there's different business criticalities. You need to view the solutions that you're building in that prism. So what we did at Arrow is before we actually set out on our development journey, we sat back and thought about how we're going to approach it. And we realised that for all the different methodologies that we could adopt, and one of those was the Arrow project delivery framework, none of them really fit across the spectrum of solutions that we're looking to deliver. So what we decided to do was categorise our solutions and tailor our development approach. And what that meant was looking at what things we need to do to deliver a solution successfully depending on the category of solution that we built. So I feel that was a real key component in our success in delivering solutions fast. It wasn't just me, it was other people in the business as well. But having that framework, setting that up at the beginning really helped us drive and get a lot of solutions out quickly that worked and really drove business value and that we could demonstrate drove business value. So the different categories, we looked at, well, what artifacts do we need to produce when we're building the solution? So what type of specifications do we need? What type of user documentation, if any? What type of support documentation do we need handed over? What detail do we go to there? What sort of testing regime do we need? Can we just hand it off to someone and ask them to test it and come back and say okay, or do we need to implement a rigorous testing regime? What sort of sign-off do you need? Is it okay if the process owner just sends you an email and says it works, or do you need some sort of formal sign-off through the business and at a high level? How are you going to deal with changes? Is there a change regime in place that you need to follow that's quite onerous, or can you just say, look, if you want to change this field, I'll do it for you and we'll push it out? So what we're ultimately trying to do is balance the governance of how we deliver processes with the speed that we can get them out. So we're trying to not top load the process with a lot of what I view as sometimes unnecessary work just to get a solution out the door. So we're looking at the type of solution it is, categorising it and tailoring our development approach accordingly. So what we did was just before I get to that, one key important part, I guess, is getting agreement in the business about how you're going to do that. So we didn't just come up with this formula and run off with it. We went back to the business and importantly the PMO in the IT department, and we got agreement. We said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to categorise the solutions, we're going to produce these type of artefacts, we're going to get this sign off, we're going to do this and this and this. And everyone agreed on that, and that facilitated us getting solutions out the door quickly because there wasn't people asking questions. There wasn't a solution to go out the door and someone said, hang on, did you do the proper testing for this? We all had that agreed up in front. And that reduced the friction in the business. We didn't have to constantly battle and fight, especially with our own IT department, about getting solutions out. And just in my experience, it usually is the IT department that's battling when you try to get things done, not the business. So we came up with 3 categories of solutions. The first one was what we just called simple form. The characteristics of a simple form are really this. It's a form, put some data into it, you submit it, and that's the end of the process. The data can be captured in a database through a smart object, but it may just go into an email and sent off to another recipient or another system. So an example would be a password reset form. You fill out your details, you hit submit, it sends an email to a service desk system, the service desk system takes over, that's the end of your process. So it's very simple. There's not a lot that can go wrong with a process like that. You may be looking into some other line of business system to have some reference data. But basically the data itself is being used by another system. It's not need to be persisted in any manner. You don't need to keep it anywhere. You don't need to manage the process. It's very straightforward. The second category we came up with was form and workflow. So this formed the bulk of what we were doing. And really it meant that there was some kind of end-to-end process that we're trying to cover. So typically an approval process. Someone wanted to get something done. They submit a form. That form may have some lookups into other line of business systems to act as reference data. We capture that data, then we send it off on a process. We get people to do tasks, and at the end of that task or that process, some outcome is achieved. It's either approved or declined, and we may feed it off to another system to take care of a further upstream process. An important characteristic of that is you usually have a process administrator. You have someone in the business who's actually managing that process, and we're going to give them some tools to give them control over their process. So they've got some reports, they've got some views into the data, they can get some analytics out of the system to know what's going on with their process. And they can respond to customers when they come back and say, what's happening with my request. And then finally, we looked at applications. So an application is, I think what we're all familiar with is an application. It's a set of persistent data. People are reading and writing back to that data. There's different categories of users. They have different permissions. We have maybe a variety of different workflows, a variety of different interfaces. So in the more traditional sense of an application, we also have the same type of process administrator, someone who's owning the process, probably more of an application owner, more of a process administrator, but we still need to provide them with extra tools to manage their process. So those were the three categories we came up with. And as you can imagine, we looked at what artifacts we needed to build, what type of processes we need to go through, respective of those different categories. And you can imagine for a simple form versus an application, the difference that we managed to decide on. So a simple form pretty much could go with a one-page Excel specification that just said, here's my fields, here's my data types, here's my rules, here's what happens when I submit it, versus an application which had the full suite of documentation that you may need to build an application. Probably involve more people as well, a business analyst if we could get one, but you're going to have a bigger team building an application in a simple form. We minimise any kind of extra effort that we need to go through to get a solution delivered. So we can get a simple form out the door in literally a day. Someone could come to us and say, this is a form I need, this is what it does. Provided there wasn't any real issue with it, you could build that and have that out the door in a day. People just have their minds blown and do something like that. So what I want to touch on now is the use of prototypes. So I'm a big fan of the prototype, and one of the reasons that I'm a big fan is that if you get a prototype in front of the business as soon as possible, you do a number of things. First of all, you keep their interest. So think about this. When someone comes to the IT department or comes to you and says, hey, I've got this process I want to automate, that's usually the peak of their, as Pete said, their eagerness. That's the peak of their real enthusiasm for that, because they've actually plucked up the time and courage to come and see you, and they said they want it. They've probably been doing something at desk and going, this is really giving me the shits. I'm going to go and see IT and get them to do something about this. Or they've been for a long time wanting to do it and finally got the, all the information together. So that's the peak interest usually. After that, it usually starts to wane a bit. So if you can keep their interest by getting something in front of them very quickly, you keep that interest going and you're more likely to have a successful outcome. So it also helps them visualize the solution. There's nothing like getting the toy and playing with it. Having a dry specification document to review really doesn't do much for business people. A, they probably don't understand it. B, they don't read it. And C, they don't really know what to do with that type of document. It's more of an internal process. So when you give them a prototype, you really stimulate thinking and discussion. Get people in a room, you say, this is how it works, you show it to them, you give it to them, they go away, they play with it, and they all come back to you with ideas about how to improve the process or something that you've missed or something that we shouldn't be doing. So it drives the requirements. So you can sit there with someone in a room with a whiteboard and try and decide how a process works, and you pretty much get 50% of it there, and then people's minds start to waver because they can't see the solution. If you give them the solution, you say, this is what it will do, this is how it works, then their minds start really thinking, and they go, okay, well I see what we can do now, and yes, we need to involve this person, I forgot about this. So it really drives the requirements. So you can use the prototype to keep driving the requirements. Finally, it makes you look good. If you can get something in front of the business in a matter of days and say, hey, look, what we're talking about, is this going to work? And they go, wow, that's amazing. People expect IT to be months or years before they give you something. How many projects have you been involved with where the business just lose interest after a while because you haven't shown them anything, you're still trying to work something out? K2 is fantastic in that regard. You can build a prototype, get it in front of them in a couple of days, and they just go, wow, that's unreal. And it keeps their enthusiasm for the project. So put it in the UAT environment, the test environment, and let them play with it. They'll come back to you very quickly. Give it to as many people as you can. It doesn't need to do everything. It's not a full solution. It doesn't need to have all the bells and whistles. It can just have out-of-the-box stuff like task notifications. Don't go crazy. Just give them the bare bones and just show them how it's going to work. Get their minds thinking. It's also an educational tool. I think we all know what a workflow and a form and all that kind of stuff is, but quite often in the business, especially in the different industries that you might work in, some of these people have got very they're not really sure what you're talking about when you're talking about a workflow or a form. They need to be shown, and once you give that in front of them and get them play with it and become familiar with it, it's a really good educational tool, and it just facilitates the release of that product solution in the business. And typically, it becomes the final solution. Unless you've kind of really gone off course and you need to go back and start again, you can just modify that prototype into the final solution. You don't need to go back and rebuild things or start all over again. You just modify that into the final solution. And finally, it's also a process qualification. You might find that while you're building it, you're scratching your head and going, I don't really know how this is going to work. And then you give something to the business and they go, oh yeah, but there's this and this and this, and then you sort of look at each other and you go, yeah, this may not work. This isn't a real valid process, or it's just too complicated, or we don't have access to this data, we're never going to get that. And you come to the conclusion, okay, well this isn't a process we're going to automate. So instead of wasting weeks and months on specifying something up and then getting to build it and realising it doesn't work, you've maybe wasted a day or two before you get that far. So it's a really good qualification tool. So one aspect I think that's kind of overlooked quite a lot is giving the business control over the process. So you built something, it works, you hand it over and you go, whew, that's it, I'm done with that. And next day they ring you up and go, how do you do that? Or I'm not sure if this works properly. And you're like, okay, and suck back into it immediately. If you can manage to hand over your process such that A, the process owners and the people that are using it understand it, and B, they know how to manage it, then you're really going to reduce the burden on yourself and IT for people coming back to you. And you're going to drive user adoption, because the people that own the business process, if they understand it, if they know how it works, they will push it on the business. They will make sure that it gets used. If they're not sure how it works and they're a bit unsure what to do when something goes wrong, then they may not be so keen to push that process through the business. So educate your process owners and your business users. Tell them what is a workflow, what's an electronic form. All these are basic questions. What's a task? What's a work list? Explain all these things to them, show them how they work. How are they going to manage their process? Show them how they can redirect a task. Show them how they can cancel a process. Show them little extras like out of office, the reports. Talk to them about K2 terminology. Process instance, what the hell does that mean? No one knows what that means until you start working in K2. And finally, give them some help. Give them a place to go to. Give them some material that they can reference. Give them the tools to manage the process. It's really going to make your life a lot easier in the long run. Now, one great tool that we did use was the process portals. Now, unfortunately, 2013 SharePoint doesn't have that. I am told by the K2 people that there will be some replacement products for that. We'll see how that comes through. But otherwise, you can build forms and reports. You can build views into data. You can build reports. You can do things that allow the business to have the control and insight into into their product. You can do it with K2. I want to touch on some of the development essentials. And as I mentioned earlier, this isn't really an insight that I think anyone in this room who's a developer will gain from. But what I'm trying to push here is that when you're with your clients, and especially when you're a consultant and you're in a business that isn't your own, I think it's incumbent on you to educate them about how they should be doing their development processes. Quite often, they've never done anything like this before. Quite often the people are new to the tool set. They may have been a developer of some other type of product, but you really need to set the process up for them to give them the best chance of success. Now, one interesting thing I think is that quite often, especially when you're starting out with the process automation, is you try and cater for every exception. So your customer tells you, oh yeah, but occasionally this happens, and then we do this, and then Joe goes off and talks to Fred, and then we come back and decide to do this, and you go, oh God, how am I going to do this? I've got to build this, and you start thinking about how you're going to do that. Stop, ask the guy or the girl, how often does that happen? They go, oh, yeah, it might happen once a year or something. And you go, okay, we're going to manage that by exception. Don't cater for every exception. Now, there's some qualifications there. If it's a business critical process, if it's driving your revenue in, if one exception can cost you a lot of money, then of course you need to cater for that exception. But for most processes, there's a little bandwidth there where you can say, all right, I'm comfortable that if a few of these processes occasionally go off the rails a bit because of some unknown or unexpected happening, then we can deal with that. And give them the tools, like you've given them the tools to manage the process. They can see when something's not working. You give them the tools to manage it. Now, as a developer, we all like to set naming conventions. This isn't really about your development environment naming conventions. This is more about thinking about the business user. So when you look at your URL for your smart form, put something in there that means something to the business. When you're calling your workflow something, call it something that means something to the business. When you're calling your activity something, call it something that means something to the business, because they're going to see it. They're going to go to their work list and they're going to see WF underscore and the task is this, and they're going to go, what does that mean? Remember that your business users are going to see some of these things, so call them meaningful names. And think about what you're going to do with that. The other thing is like a folio name can be something that's people neglect to put in there, so you get an empty folio, or you put something in there that's meaningless to the end user but meaningful to the developer. Think about your end user. Establish your patterns and practices. So build up a repository of patterns and practices that you're going to establish in your business. This isn't so much sort of development techniques, but more things that how you're going to set up a consistent approach to your solutions from the end user's perspective. So one example of that is when we go and close a form in a smart form, we close the browser. In IE, you just get a nice empty tab. So we decided, well, that's not really nice. That's not really a good user experience. So we just created another generic redirect form. And so whenever you finished with a process or a form, it would take you to that other form and it would say, thank you for doing whatever you've just done. You can now close this browser tab. When you give people a consistent interface like that, they become more accepting of the process. Every process is the same. It just helps facilitate releasing solutions in the business. Emails, when you send an email out of the workflow system, make them the same. Give them the same look and feel. Give the forms the same look and feel so they work the same way. You put that down on paper so that anyone that comes into the business starts working with you also has access to that. You're going to need a dev in a private environment, and I kind of wondered about putting that on the slide, but it does happen where you don't have a dev environment, and it can cause all sorts of problems. Get your client to put a dev environment in. Think about whether you need a single development environment or one for each developer. It really just depends on the size of the team and what you're trying to achieve. So think about that. Also think about a staging and a test environment. Doing a K2 system upgrade can really throw a spanner in the works in terms of getting solutions out the door. If you go and upgrade your dev environment and you come across an issue and you ring up Quintus and go, what's this? It might be a week or two before you've got that solved. In the meantime, you've stopped being able to deploy anything from development into UAT because you've got different system versions. Having a staging or testing environment where you can go and do a test system upgrade, see if it works, will really help you in the long run, stop you from coming into those problems. This is one I've discovered kind of recently. I always was in the habit of deploying quite regularly from dev to UAT. But if you don't do that, especially with larger projects, you're going to come across problems. Deployment will always reveal some kind of issue. If you leave it to the last minute and package everything up in one big bundle and try and deploy it into another environment, you're going to come across some issues and you're going to give yourself some big headaches. Constantly deploy between your environments into UAT and discover those issues when they're small and fixable rather than when they're big and a massive nightmare to fix. Discovering those issues will just save you a lot of time in the long run. It reduces the time spent with K2 support, which they don't want, and you keep your deadlines. So just another aspect that I think is a little bit neglected is the measure and report side of it. So we've really touched on this before, but how are you going to tell your business that what you've done is giving them some benefit? How are you going to sell yourself? How are you going to continue to have a job? How are you going to prove that K2 is doing what they thought it was going to do? Well, you need to gather some metrics on the process that you automate. You need to find out, before I automate it, what's it doing now? How long does it take? Who's doing it? How long does it take them to do it? How many are they submitting a month? What's the elapsed process? What's the actual time taken for each individual step? How many processes are being instigated in a period? Get the business to confirm those numbers too. Don't just make them up, but go back to them and say, this is what I think and this is what we've gathered, and get them to confirm it as well, because then they own it as well. They don't come back later on and go, we never said that. And then use K2 reports and other data to capture what you need about the process. So think about that when you're developing. Think about how we're going to know how long this took or how long people did things. How many have been submitted in a month. And then report your findings. Don't wait for them to come and ask you. Go and tell the business, this is what we did. Tell your manager, tell the process owners, send them reports saying, look, there was 50 of these submitted last month and it only took a day for each one. Beforehand it was taken 2 weeks. Push that information back to the business. Tell them how much quicker and more accurate the process is. You used to have this many go back for a rework. Now there's only 1 or 2 going back for a rework a month. And finally, one surprising aspect, I guess, about when I started with K2 was change is usually the moment when you build a solution, you give it out, and within a couple of days someone comes back and says, we need this. And all of a sudden you're thinking, okay, I'm back to square one, I've got to go and do all this work, I've got to get it approved, and blah, blah, blah. K2 makes it a lot easier. So when I say embrace change, change is a good thing. It means that the business are actually using your application. They're not going to come back with changes if they haven't used it. They don't come back with a change that doesn't work. In that case. So it's usually straightforward. And I put a disclaimer there. Nothing's ever completely straightforward, but most often the changes that they come back to you with, you can tell pretty much straight away whether it's going to be a problem or not. And most of the time with K2, it's not that hard to push through. Just remember that your app may be a short-term solution. It doesn't have to live for years. It may just be solving a temporary gap in the business functionality at the moment. So just remember that in terms of change, that just because you're building something doesn't mean it's going to be there for the long haul. And with that, thank you for listening, and if you've got any questions, you can answer.